Well, hello, friends. It is Between Two Sundays with Mark Beresford and Mark Gladman. Welcome, Mark Beresford.
Thank you, Mark Ladman.
Thank you very
Good to
much.
be here.
And good to be here with you. Between Two Sundays, of course, is the show where we reflect on the readings for each week from the Revised Common Lectionary, which we find at lectionary.library.vanderbilt.edu or something like that. Look up Vanderbilt Lectionary and it'll come up, along with a whole bunch of really cool resources you can use to reflect on the readings or even use them in your preaching or what have you as well. Some great stuff there. But we reflect on these in two ways at the start of each week, or at the start of each show. We reflect on how we've lived out of the readings from the week previous, and the remainder two-thirds of the show is focusing on reflecting into the readings for the week to come. And so that's what we do, and we're glad that you could have joined us. How's that?
Fantastic that someone's joined us.
That explains. Someone has joined. I love the way you put that. I'm glad it's a few more than someone, but anyway, there we
I
go.
hope so.
So, normally, as I said at the start of each show, we would elucidate on how we've lived out of the readings from the Sunday as we move into the week. As we kick off this week's show, though, I just want to share a quote from Steve Salinder, who dropped a note onto our YouTube version of the show, which is no different to the podcast version of the show, mind you. But that's where he's seen it and left the comment. And I thought it'd be cool if I read Steve's comment, because I think he's picked out the stuff that we might have done. This is just us being lazy and relying on somebody else to do the work for us. But anyway, so Steve, in reflecting on last week's readings, which, by the way, I should tell you what they were. That's going to tell me doesn't like that. There we go. So last week's readings were from Genesis 25 verses 19 to 34, Psalm 119 verses 105 to 112, Romans 8 verses 1 to 11, and Matthew 13 verses 1 to 9 and 18 to 23. And Steve, he pulled out the reading from the Hebrew scriptures as well as the Romans reading, where he says this. He says, it's interesting to ponder how the dysfunctional dynamic in Jacob and Rebekah's family would have been different if everyone could have been in the good soil place and really tried to listen first and act accordingly. Paul has defined his plight as well in Romans 7 and 8 by elucidating the wrestling he goes through with his spirit and flesh, the good and the bad he wants to do and doesn't want to do. Here's the rhetorical question that Steve has now. He says, do we fail to be good soil? Do we fail to listen effectively? Do we follow the path of the flesh rather than the spirit? Do we overpower hope with expectation because we want to be in control and want to have control all the time, rather than be still and know that God is God? Is it more presently satisfying to act out first rather than wait? That's a really, really good thought.
Wow.
I mean, my initial reaction to that is absolutely. I mean, that's all of
Yeah,
us, isn't it?
cool.
And in talking about, Jacob and Rebekah's promise, of course, any family that heard a promise like that would probably want to go, let's see if we can help this trundle along. I think about when you have applied for jobs and then seen an opportunity to try and not manipulate things, but put
Yeah.
things in good standing or something.
Yeah.
Those types of things. I mean, not all of us do that with those sorts of things all the time. We're not all manipulative people, but even just the simple act of trying to put ourselves in a stronger position or give ourselves even just the G up, even if it's just for us, to try and get things out there and move along, rather than be patient, which doesn't seem to be a very strong human characteristic at all.
Yeah. I'm reading a book at the moment about, and one chapter of it talks about, the history of counting time. And really the argument is, since we did that, we've been in a rush ever since. That we seem to have had less time the more closely we've been able to count it. Gee, I really like what Steve was saying there, actually. I think he's found very clearly a theme that runs through these passages. And for me, it's, and I've said this many times on this show, it's all getting back to humility. The listening, the call to listen, the humility to recognize this this split between spirit and flesh, as Paul puts it. This family that sort of fights for dominance. Each of them are really would do well to. We do really well to encounter a God who is revealed in the most humble of ways, death on a cross, and the vulnerability of death and dependence for resurrection on another. I really like what he's pulling out there, and I do wonder if it just boils down to, are we humble enough to listen? Are we humble enough to be honest with what's going on in and of ourselves? Are we humble enough to enter into our relationships as listeners rather than manipulators?
You've raised a really important point here in terms of this conversation that Steve's raised as well, the factor of time. I remember one of Richard Rohr's audio programs talking about the world of St. Francis of Assisi. And he was saying that in St. Francis's time, it was this time of change. And one of the things that changed was the development of clocks. Got to a point where they could be placed in public. Now, up until that time, and especially in these European villages around where St. Francis lived and a bit further afield, obviously. But in that world, the town would mark time by the bells of the church that would call for morning and evening prayer and mass, if mass was going to happen that day, if they're going to have a Eucharist. But during the time of St. Francis, towns started to erect clocks in the town square. And so time was marked in a very different way. It wasn't just 2 bells a day that reminded you it's time for prayer and it's time for prayer. Now people were working to a clock that everyone could see in the center of the village, and they could mark their days by time, which changed everything in terms of the way we work. But I also am jogged by you bringing that up and Steve's comment to think about the idea that time plays on us so much that when we sense that God might be doing something or that something might be afoot and God's involved and we like it, we try and push things along. And the only reason I think we do that is because we mark time in a way that we think that if we leave this too long or leave this too short, or if we don't do it now, we've got to do it short, so we can't leave it too long. If we didn't have time, we would know that.
Yes.
If we didn't mark time in that way, we would know that. So I think that's a really interesting thing to ponder. Is how does time affect the way we act or don't act on these things? And is our patience or impatience connected to the amount of importance we have placed on time in our current world? And if we could bring ourselves to a place of saying, well, time, sure, got to show up to work on time, got to pick up the kids on time, but if I can forget about time ruling us in the way that it tends to, will that help this impatience that I so often jump into? I really love that connection.
Yeah. I'm glad you made the connection, Mark, because I said I was reading about time today and I completely forgot why I said that, but you've made it make sense. So I appreciate it.
Where'd the time go? Anyway, there it is again. So Here we go. This week's readings. That was the seventh Sunday after Pentecost, by the way. We are now on the 8th Sunday after Pentecost. And our readings this week are Genesis 28, verses 10 to 19, Psalm 139, verses 1 to 12, and then 23 to 24. Romans 8, verses 12 to 25, and Matthew 13, verses 24 to 30, and 36 to 43. As I said, we've got all our readings coming from the Vanderbilt Library, and we highly recommend that the stuff and the resources that they have. Mate, and we'll put them in the show notes too, so you'll be able to find them there as well. Do you want to just work through from Genesis as we have been?
I'm quite happy to do that. Yeah, really significant passage in Genesis, actually.
Yeah, tell me, where'd you go?
This dream, where Yahweh stands in front of it's Jacob, isn't it? Of course. In this dream, and reaffirms reaffirms the call and purpose that was originally given to Abraham, of course. This promise and this hope that this great people will arrive and arise and wonder, and again we have this affirmation that they are to be blessed, or to be blessed to be a blessing. Families of the earth will be blessed in you and in your offspring. Really, I was, maybe because I've been reading a little bit about dreams and the significance of them. This is not unusual in Genesis for God to speak through a dream. And here we have one of those very vivid dreams. I don't think you need to fall into the category of every time I dream anything, it's of massive import. But this is one of those dreams where Jacob has woken up, remembered it, and it's clearly grown in his understanding of what's happened in this place. Very strong sense of place in this little passage. A relatively detailed description of where he is. Then this stone is put in place as well. It could be it's almost got echoes of a standing stone, doesn't it? Jacob marking this space, and naming it Bethel, which of course becomes a city, or at least a town, over time. A very significant little, passing on of the torch, passing on of the promise to this one.
Yeah. The standout line for me, and only because I've had my face in it for a number of weeks now, is surely the Lord was in this place and I did not know.
Yeah.
And the reason why it's been in my face is because I have been studying and using as a teaching resource for the table, my website, Lawrence Kushner's book, Rabbi Lawrence Kushner's book, Surely God Was in This Place and I did not know. Now, in that book, Kushner looks at this one verse of scripture through 7 different rabbinical schools.
Oh, wow.
And the teachings of 7 different rabbis.
Yeah.
And seeks to understand what this might mean from each of those rabbis' perspectives. And what's interesting is you end up with 7 different understandings of what this line means, which is incredibly powerful. But the one that really sticks for me is, and by the way, he notes that the second I think it has something to do with the Hebrew, but surely the Lord was in this place and I, capital I, comma, I did not know, little I.
Yeah.
And so the difference there is that there's this big I and this little I. Or to use the language of Patrick Oliver, who I've referred to a few times and have talked about over on my website as well, you've got the I and you've also got the me. The
Yes.
me being the ego self, the I being the self that finds its identity in God and doesn't need all the other trimmings and trappings. And that's the understanding that I think I find is compelling about what Jacob's saying here. I suspect that this is a turning point in Jacob's walk. Up until now,
Mm.
he's been that manipulator, he's been that schemer, he's been that guy who's trying to, as Steve mentioned in his comment there, push the boundaries of patience by trying to get
Mm.
things to happen in his way and a lot sooner, and to ensure it happens by setting things up so that it can't fail. All of a sudden, you've got this event where you've got this ladder and the angels going up and down on the ladder, which, by the way, is ascent and descent. There's two things happening here.
Yes. Yes.
But what's really compelling is that his response is, "Surely the Lord was in this place, and I did not know."
Mm.
In other words, that ego self has been so in the way. I haven't been able to see God in the events of my life. My parents had this word from God. We had this thing that happened. Surely he's heard the stories about what happened at birth when the hand
Yes.
sticks out and all that other stuff.
Yeah.
I did this thing where I tried to get my brother to sign over his birthright and exchanged it for some lentil soup. I've gone to the point of trying to deceive my father and succeeding in a way by putting goat skins over my shoulders, which set my brother to a point where he now hates my guts.
Mm.
And here I am. And I'm at this place now where now I've had this um, encounter with this angel, which is probably God, and in some sort of um, uh, revelatory way. This is not necessarily God's image per se, nor is it anthropomorphic, because Jacob has this literal encounter and then wrestle at another point. But surely the Lord was in this place and I did not know it. Surely God has been here with me all along. God has been um, moving things and shaping things for the way that they should be to honor God. And I've completely missed it because my little I, my me,
Yeah.
has been in the way. And therefore the big I hasn't been able to emerge.
Mm.
And now he's at a point where he goes, verse 17, after that, how awesome is this place? There is none other than the house of God, and this is the gate of heaven. In other
Mm.
words, I recognize, I see now. And that, I think, is one of those transforming hinge moments
Yeah.
that starts to move Jacob more to trust God and how God is going to move things rather than try and force the hand himself.
So transformational moment. Once again, as we were saying before, this is a movement from self-centeredness to an open eyes that see in a brand new, humble way.
Or to use the language of Paul from last week, it's from flesh to spirit.
Yes, yes, absolutely, absolutely. I'm
Yeah.
really, I'm always struck by this it seems like very deliberate language describing this dream as angels ascending and descending between heaven and earth. And I love this. For me, it's got echoes of the incarnation. It's so grounded. It's not heaven in this detached form. It's heaven in an attached form to the earth. There's something very grounded, and here we are in the middle of nowhere. This is not a major city and a major temple where everything's happening and where you'd expect God to turn up, but it's in the middle of nowhere. Of course, we change that as the story goes on, and it becomes a temple space, and this place is set aside and remembered and revered, and there's pilgrimages to it. But initially, this is just heaven connected to earth.
Yeah.
All those echoes of the sermon on, the Lord's Prayer, isn't it? Your will be done on earth as in heaven. This
Yeah. Yeah.
this deep sense of connection between the two. And Jacob, all he's had here is his eyes open to it, and it's changed his very being, I think, as you've said, from being deceitful to being deeply humble, I think, recognizing there are things going on around him that he does not know,
Yeah.
that he has been blind to. And you know, I wonder if in marking this spot there's a sense of I don't want to forget. I want to be able to come back to this space. I want to remember.
Mm. Yeah, and I think this is why this psalm is so a perfect selection for this.
Yes.
Because
Yeah.
the very simple outcome of this is when we say things like God will remember me, we're not saying God has a memory and God will bring us up in God's memory.
Capacity to forget.
Where yeah, as if God can forget anything. What we're saying is that we feel seen by God.
Yes. Yes.
And this is Jacob's experience here. In this moment. He suddenly goes, oh, my eyes are open. So it's not just Jacob who sees, it's also Jacob being seen. And he
Yeah.
realizes that he is always seen. There is never a place where he can be, where he is absent from God. And so he need not worry about the seeming absence of God from the plans that he's been told about, or from the hopes and dreams that his mother placed in his heart about his future and the generation going through him and not his brother. There's this sense then of all of a sudden God hasn't forsaken me. God is here with me and I am seen. And that's exactly what this psalm's all about. This
Yes,
is
it
a
is.
psalm that literally talks about being unable to escape God. A psalm that talks about not being able to go anywhere. We're absent from God. And this is why, and if you've read my stuff long enough, you've probably heard me quote this umpteen times, but in Alan Watts' incredible master's thesis that he wrote while he was an Episcopal priest, and it was published in 1947, and it's called Behold the Spirit. You can still buy it today. There's a whole big section in there that talks about this, and he literally says, now remember, this is 1947. He's an Episcopal priest. This is his Masters of Theology thesis as part of his growing in his Christian ministry. He says this. He says the problem isn't getting God. The problem is getting away from God. You can't. And this is why now is so important, and recognizing that the now is all we have, because the now is God itself. God is all we have. God is this moment. And that's the connection. And this psalm reminds us of that God is with us, that God is for us, that God will never leave us, and there's nowhere we can go where we can be absent from God, so we must never fear. And that comes down to not just God being around, but also making sure that the things that are going on around us can serve some purpose. And I word it like that on purpose, because I think we get stuck when we start to say things like, this is God's will. I'm really sorry, but my dad dropping dead at his desk at work at the age of 45 was not God's will. That was illness and sickness that was in my father's body.
Yeah.
Right. But I tell you what, in hindsight, and I would never say this to somebody in the moment, but in hindsight, 30 years on, in 2 months' time, it'll be 30 years since that happened. But boy, how that has shaped me in good ways. And that's taken time. And it's been a process. And it's been hard. But I can look at that and I can go, God has been with me. Not God forsook me and killed my dad so I could grow into XYZ. No. Stuff happens. But I need never fear that God was absent. God was there with me in that moment. God was with my dad in that moment. This is where the theology, where we have everything that is good is from God and everything that's not good is not from God. That's really poor theology.
Yeah.
I think when Jesus says life is to be lived to the fullest, that he's literally saying everything about life, and positive and negative, is valuable. That good stuff is great, bad stuff is a part of life, and experiencing it and allowing ourselves to feel the fullness of those feelings. Or that's any counselor, any psychologist will tell you that's an important part of the process. That's what it means to live life to the full, not negate it and say, oh, I'm not going to feel those feelings because those feelings are not of God. Rubbish. If they weren't of God, God would never have given us those feelings to experience and feel in the first place.
It should make us very curious people about ourselves, I think, about what goes on in our hearts, what things become distinct in our memories.
Right.
I think all of these things, they should make us very curious about who we are and what, where God is in those experiences. I think there's a question I've noticed in both this Genesis reading and this Psalm reading. You've got Yahweh standing beside Jacob in this dream, and then you've got this most intriguing line in Psalm 139: "You hem me in behind and before." You kind of combine these, and you've got, and then you've got the dimension of ascending and descending as well in the Genesis account. You really do have this impression of one who is everywhere, that I can't look anywhere where God isn't.
Yep.
And I read this Genesis account, and I think surely you'd have to describe it as a pretty special moment for Jacob. But does every moment carry this potential? Does every moment carry the potential of revealing God in a way as significant as this?
Well, I think for Jacob it does now.
Yeah.
At the very end, that's exactly what he says.
Yes.
God was in this place and I did not know it. There is this sense now that, when I go places, I'm going to see and recognize that God is here. I can't be away from it and can't escape it, which is exactly where the psalmist goes.
Yeah, an amazing psalm. I'm not.
Oh, sorry, go on.
I just wanted to point to the popularity of Psalm 139. I think it's very significant. I don't think it's always used well, and our edition here has. I haven't checked this out, but there's certainly a point of violence in this psalm that is usually edited out from a
which is why those two verses are missing. That's correct.
Yeah. Which I got to say, in this psalm especially, really disturbs me. I love that the psalmist can say, God knows me completely, and I am filled with hate for my enemies.
Yes.
And God still knows me completely. I think there's, in this psalm especially, because these two are held alongside one another, God knowing me completely and this almost spontaneous revelation of hate within my heart for my brother. And that changes nothing. I think there's something remarkable in this psalm, that when we get caught up in just the violence of this or the hatred of this, and therefore want to edit it out, I think we lose something deeply important and deeply freeing for us.
Yeah.
In our capacity, because these are prayers, the Psalms are prayers, in our capacity to pray from who we really are, not who we wish we were.
Yes.
And this is one of those Psalms that makes me think I can bring to God any aspect of who I am, no matter how ashamed I am of it, no matter how theologically wrong it is of me to be thinking these thoughts. All of that is invited, not just can be, is invited to be included in my interaction with God. My very prayers are given permission here to be indwelt by who I am, not who I wish I was.
Yeah. Which is why I think if you're going to preach from Psalm 139 this Sunday, and you're in a liturgical church where you actually recite the psalm together, add those verses back in.
Yeah.
And watch everyone get uncomfortable and call it out in a good way.
Yes.
And say, we all do this. We all drive in the car and we're beeping the horn and giving the finger and yelling at the guy and getting cranky at the lady at the cash register because she's going way too slow, and getting cranky with our Uncle Tex because he didn't do X, Y, Z.
To our watches for time.
That too. All those things. And it behooves us to remember, and this is why it's a positive thing, that despite all that, God is still with us.
Yeah.
God will never leave us or forsake us.
And not only with us, but in communion with us. This is a conversation. This is a conversation with God. It's a prayer.
Yeah. Romans 8. We continue to work through Romans with Paul, and obviously one of the more popularly quoted passages. For me, verse 15 is probably the standout. Paul has just mentioned that we are debtors not to the flesh, and we don't need to live, or the ego, not because we don't live according to the ego. Because you do that, you'll die. But if by the Spirit you put to deed, you put the ego to death, and you live for Christ, you live in the Spirit. So he goes on to say, for all who are led by the Spirit are children of God. For you did not receive a spirit of slavery, but you have received a spirit of adoption. That is the line. And I think it's an important one, and here's why. And this only jumped out at me this week. But we have a culture within Christianity that likes to talk about Jesus buying our salvation at the cross, purchasing our redemption. But that's not what's going on here. Slaves are bought. Children are adopted.
Yeah.
And it's a huge difference. Not that there isn't something that the adopted parents have to do and sacrifices they have to make in order to take the adoption on. And I'm not talking about money exchanging hands there, by the way. None of those things. I'm talking about the accommodation, the love they have to take in a child who's not their own and raise them as their own. Remember, this is adoption, not fostering. And I know many foster parents become adoptive parents for this very reason, because they love the child as if that child were their own. And they want to, and they're willing to raise that child and sacrifice finances and space in their home and time and all the other things to do that. And I think this is an incredibly important part of this passage that I, for one, missed. That this is an adoption that happens. And here's the thing. When you're adopted, you do absolutely nothing. The parents do everything to bring you in. And they'll go through the processes and jump through the hoops and sign all the paperwork and get all the documentation and have someone come out and inspect their home. And I know in some places when you're adopting, you have to go through medical checks, and you have to go to doctors who will ask you to cough and poke and prod you and take blood samples and all sorts of stuff from you to ensure that you're healthy enough and fit enough and strong enough and financially strong enough and all these other things. That's all on the parents who want to adopt, who so want this child to be in their family, that they'll do that for them and bring them in. Even to the point where, and this has happened, some children arrive at their adoptive family and go, I really don't want to be here. I don't care. And yet the parents persevere and they keep going and keep moving and keep doing their best for the child and whatever have you. And sometimes, most times, that child comes around and feels connected, and the dejection that they've come with gets enveloped in this love. It changes everything. But, we mustn't fall into the trap of being thought of as slaves to the point that we forget that this is an act of adoption. And this is not the only place where Paul uses that word. This is a word that Paul uses quite often. It's in the first chapter of Ephesians. You are adopted. And so the adoption metaphor is there. And it's the very end that we get to the crux of what this is really about. For in hope we were saved. Remembering that hope and expectation are two completely different things, and hope has no idea how it's all going to turn out or how it's going to happen. It just does. Now, hope that is seen is not hope, for who hopes what is seen? But if we hope for what we do not see, we wait for it with, and there's the word, patience.
Yeah. There seems to be I don't know. There's a bit of a theme through this. If you're being adopted by Christ, you will suffer. We will suffer with him. And then there's this patience asked for at the end. I wonder if we really are being invited to enter into the life of God here. And, if there's one thing we know about Christ, God through the incarnation, is that it's that God is willing to embrace suffering on behalf of others. And of course, then we see this first fruits language used of Jesus rising again, the first fruits of many to come. Here it's used again. And then this entering into patience. We are learning the patience of God. It's all the language of what you've been saying just there. It's the language of adoption. It's the language of belonging. It's the language of being part of this family.
Yeah.
And there's something really important there. I think we, almost like spoiled children at times, think I'm adopted. Everything is being done for me. I'm adopted. It's all being given to me. I don't have any responsibility. Actually, you're a part of this family now.
Yes.
And you're learning this family's culture. You're learning this family's values. So all this language of where Paul is going out of his way, I think, to express belonging. The Abba Father, the Spirit bearing witness with our spirits, children of God, children heirs of God, joint heirs with Christ. All this language is kind of building up, not to say God has done everything for you and therefore you don't have to be part of it, but actually to say you belong here. This is where your life will be found. This is where, this is the culture you've been adopted into. where you are learning the very heart of God.
Mm.
And the ultimate outcome here, as you point out correctly, is patient endurance.
Yeah.
Because this is what God is like. And that's not, that's not a harsh, you must be patient. It's this is the journey we're on. This is the journey we're on with God. We're learning this path of being gracious, patient, other serving. And indeed, this passage goes out of its way to make sure we know this is not just something between me and God, but this is a cosmic reality with all creation patiently waiting as well. We're just joining in, essentially, we're just joining in the way things are. The way God is, the way creation is, the way the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus pointed. We're just learning to be part of that.
Yeah.
More
seed.
And more patience.
Yeah. Yeah. It's back again. It's really important to understand that Matthew 13 is a chapter of Matthew's gospel, which is all, except for when you get to the last couple, all about seed.
Yeah, there's a very consistent theme here, isn't it?
Very consistent theme, which probably encourages us to then think about what Jesus is saying in its totality. So when we're reading this week's reading, which is verses 24 to 30, 24 to 30, and then jumps down to 36 for the explanation, jumps over the parable of the mustard seed in the east, which are also different types of seed, by the way.
Yeah.
But in understanding this parable, a couple of things are really important. This is probably one of the most misunderstood parables in the whole Bible, because most people think, right, so the wheat is the good people, and the seed are the weeds are the bad people, and at the end of time, they're going to pull everything up, and they're going to be separated, and all the bad people are going to be thrown on eternal, unquenchable fire and die in hell. That's not what this is about. It's probably really important to point that out right from the outset. That's not where we're going and not what's happening here. The very first parable that Jesus teaches in this chapter. Now, remember he's talking to a whole bunch of people who were there in chapter 12 when Jesus was having this confrontation with the Pharisees. And remember that Jesus has mentioned that the reason why he teaches in parables is, to put it in layman's terms, if he speaks plainly, he's going to get shot tomorrow. That's why he speaks in parables, right? Because in parables, it's a little bit cryptic, and people suddenly go, now we see what you're getting at. And it's usually the people who are the ones who you're speaking against who take ages to get it. So it's buying himself some time, basically, before he gets nailed to a cross and killed. So when Jesus was responding, first of all, and talking about seed and so on, he says there that the seed is the word of God. Now, I know that in the response here, Jesus says that the good seed stands for the sons of the kingdom and the weeds are the sons of the evil one, right? But the good seed, sons of the kingdom. So the sons of the kingdom are, now, and remember, sons is something that's used all the way through Scripture, particularly in the Christian Testament, to talk about lots of things: sons of sedition, sons of thunder, sons of this, that, and the other. And it's not always humans; it's not always people. It's sometimes it's talking about concept. It's talking about something that has come from something. So if we use that and get away from that a little bit, when Jesus explains the parable, and you very carefully look at what he's saying, you start to see a slightly different picture to the one that's probably the most common. The one who sowed the good seed is the Son of Man. That's the term that Jesus often uses for himself.
Yeah.
Right? The field is the world. The good seed, which is the words of God, stands for the sons of the kingdom. So this is the words of God are that goodness that comes out of this kingdom that is going to be on earth, the one that's in heaven that's coming to earth, right? The weeds are the sons of the evil one. So again, the works, the outcomes of the evil that's in the world, and the enemy who sows them is the devil. Now, the question is, there's one person that he doesn't mention there. Who are the workers in the field? And if you have a look back at the first parable again, we deduce that in this parable, the workers of the field are the disciples of Jesus. So what we have is the kingdom of heaven is like a man, Son of Man, who sowed good seed, the teachings of the kingdom, in the field, the world. But while everyone was sleeping, the enemy came and sowed weeds among the wheat. So this is the works of evil that happen in the world, and went away. When the wheat sprouted and formed heads, and the wheat also appeared, the owner's servants, or the workers of the field, came to him and said, "Sir, didn't you sow good seed in your field? When then did the weeds come from?" Now, if you're a gardener and I came to your garden and I said, "Oh, see your garden over there? There's some weeds sprouting. Where did they come from?" If you were a gardener, you would laugh in my face because it's obvious that weeds happen, man. That's just the world we live in. And anybody who's tried to garden, we've got some garden beds out there that are literally filled with nothing but the stuff we've picked up at the hardware store, the compost, the soil, and the whatever it is they call it, and we've tipped those bags in, literally, you know, carloads fulls of these bags in these containers that we have in the yard where we grow some vegetables, and there's weeds in there, dude. There's weeds going in there. This is, where did the weeds come from? Stupid question. Weeds just happen. Birds drop the seed, or they just come through the soil, or they don't, they're existing in some other way, or a rodent drops it, or someone poops it, or whatever. But weeds happen, right? And so in this story, where did the weeds come from? You can imagine Jesus' followers, a lot of them who would have been agricultural, sitting around going, "That's, we all know where the weeds come from. Weeds just happen." And they replied, "Well, the enemy did this." And then the servant asked him, "Do you want us to go and pull them up?" And that's when the man who sowed the seed says, "No, because while you're pulling the weeds up, you may root up the wheat with them." So what I'm seeing here in this parable, as I sit there and think about this, is I'm seeing my heart once again, just like the parable last week. My heart is on display. That good seed is sown in my heart, but weeds appear. No one came and sowed bad seed, but weeds appear because of stuff. I mean, we all know, we don't ask any kid, "Why did you do that?" They're going to say, "I don't know." And as someone who's worked with young people for 30 years, most of the time they don't know.
Yeah.
They're not lying to you. They just don't know. It just looked good at the time, thought it'd be fun, what have you. And think about when we do wrong. Why did you do that? And honestly, if we're on it, I mean, we can deduce it and look back and go and rationalize it. But in the moment, the reality is 9 times out of 10, we don't know. We just reacted. Just happened that way. And so it's interesting that in this parable, what we see is this good seed growing and these weeds coming up, which, by the way, most scholars think was darnel. Darnel is a weed that looks very, very much like wheat. And the only time you can tell them apart is when the wheat is getting ready to harvest. The wheat will turn golden and will start to droop, whereas the darnel will remain green and stay standing upright. That's the only way you can tell them apart. And that doesn't happen until just before the wheat is ready to be harvested. So all that time, you got this stuff growing in the field. You got no idea what's what. It just is. But this parable tells me, don't worry. Why? Because God is going to sift them apart, and the stuff that's wrong, the stuff that corrupts you, is going to be burnt away. This is a parable that I think sits very neatly with Paul's analogy, which is slightly different, of the works of human beings being wood, hay, gold, silver, precious stones, stubble, chaff. And that's all the things we do. And they're thrown in the fire, and the stuff that's not going to last is burnt away. But the stuff that's precious won't just come out intact. It will come out more valuable than when it went in. And so the parable here is very clear. For each of us, there is this weeds and this tear battling it out in our hearts. But nobody, not one person should worry. Why? Because of the adoption that Paul talked about, where we don't have to do anything. Just the matron of the adoption agency turns up in our room one day and says, pack your bag because Mr. and Mrs. such and such are taking you home. You're going to be in their family now. That's the reality for every single person that's ever walked this planet. That God has made a way to say, guess what? You're adopted and you're in this family now. And by the way, don't worry that in your bag there's some stuff that you're embarrassed about. God's going to love you anyway, with the same patience that he loved Jacob, with the same patience that he loved the psalmist, with the same patience that he loved Paul, with the same patience that God loved us. This is a beautiful parable of great hope. And this fiery furnace is not an eternal tormentous punishment. It might be painful for a while, as those things that, we learn how to live in ways that puts that stuff, that is reactionary thing behind us. But boy, the outcome is so much better for everybody. Because God would want none be lost, and God gets what God wants at the end of the day.
I find this to be a parable that also touches on or gives us reason to pause before we judge, perhaps even before we judge ourselves as well.
Yes.
The similarity between I find it remarkable. You've got the similarity between this, the young tares and the young wheat. So much so that you can't tell the difference. This is this is great reason not to be judging others. And this is a great reason to be leaving this up to the angels in the end of this explanation, to make the decision between what is a tare and what is wheat in this parable. I think this is a great reason for us to kind of be people who are just a little bit careful, who are very slow to judge what others are growing into, and perhaps even to judge what we ourselves are growing into. This is a great reason, and it's a call, I think, to patience, just like the Romans passage that we've just looked at. This is a call to be patiently moving through the world, patient with ourselves, but also patient with others, knowing that the God who knows all is the only one really equipped to make the big call on what is good and what is evil. I think this is one of those great little the similarity between the wheat and the weeds here is telling, absolutely telling, and painfully obvious to the original hearers, and a little bit disguised for us, which is most unfortunate because we tend to think it's fairly obvious. Having said all that, there's an element where in this parable where the workers do recognize that something has gone on here. So they can tell. It may be difficult, but they can tell.
Yeah. There you go. That's the 8th Sunday after Pentecost in a nutshell. Genesis 28 verses 10 to 19, Psalm 139 verses 1 to 12 and 23 to 24, but put the other bits in anyway. Romans 8 verses 12 to 25 and Matthew 13, 24 to 30 and 36 to 43. I'm hoping next week, I haven't seen, but I'm hoping next week we'll go back and do the mustard seed and the yeast. I love that passage. We'll see what happens next week. Hopefully we'll go back to it. Of course, you'll find all of those down in the show notes or just below.
You're right, we do. We go back to the mustard seed.
Dang.
You could be a lectionary writer. Your spare time.
Of course, in my spare time. What was I saying? Yes, go to Mark's website, and look, all the links are down in the show notes or just down here in YouTube. Go to Mark's website, go to my stuff, read what we have to say there, send us comments and stuff there. Send us comments here on YouTube or send us comments here on Spotify. Answer the question where I say, what did you get out of these things in the question? And you can reply and we'll read it on the show if they come through. So please engage. We want to hear what you're thinking, what your thoughts are. Just like Steve. Thank you, Steve, again.
Really appreciate that. That was great to hear from Steve.
Much appreciated. Steve's actually commented a few times. It's been awesome. And that's it. We're done.
See you later, Mark.
Nothing more to say. See you later, Mark. And see you later,
You're
everybody.
Supposed to wrap it up there, mate.
I think so. We'll catch you all next week for another episode of Between Two Sundays. Until then, peace be with you. Bye now.
Can't wait. See you then.